Facilities can be segregated as long as the facilities in question are separate but equal. In 1908, Berea College versus Kentucky, the Supreme Court finds the state of Kentucky is allowed to ban a private college from having an integrated student body. So this is how the Supreme Court is interpreting an amendment that was unambiguously written to eliminate racial discrimination. This is how they're reading into it. The Supreme Court also embarked upon the now discredited interpretation of the 14th Amendment as guaranteeing something called liberty of contract, which meant that the state either lacked the authority to regulate any contract that people entered into, because to do so violated the 14th Amendment. So the most famous liberty of contract case is the case of Lochner versus New York, where the court found the state of New York lacked the authority to set a cap at working hours for bakers at 60 hours. So the work then of the 20th and 21st century was really to undo this disastrous misreading of the 14th Amendment of the latter 19th and early 20th century, and to do so in a way that legally revitalizes the Bill of Rights. Now, the Supreme Court eventually did this in three ways. The first way that the Supreme Court's about-face on the 14th Amendment kind of legally revitalized the Bill of Rights was, as I mentioned earlier, the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment was used to incorporate the Bill of Rights, apply it to the state governments. And once the Bill of Rights is incorporated, now the Supreme Court practices what's known as Selective Incorporation, meaning the Bill of Rights is incorporated piece by piece. The process began in 1925. Most, but not all, of the Bill of Rights is incorporated as of 2018. The last time the Supreme Court incorporated a part of the Bill of Rights was in 2010, when the Supreme Court incorporated the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. So, incorporation dramatically expands the reach and power of the Bill of Rights. Because until the 20th century, if your state government was trampling on your individual liberties, you couldn't say, this violates the Bill of Rights. So the process of incorporation kind of legally revitalized the Bill of Rights. The other way the 14th Amendment really changed how the Bill of Rights is applied is through the 14th Amendment, we get what's known now as the tiered system of judicial review. And this is a legal process that began in 1938 in a footnote in a Supreme Court case about milk. Because if you're going to change how judicial review works, definitely do it in a footnote in a case about milk. That's definitely the best way to go about changing the practice of judicial review. And this tiered system of judicial review just means basically that the Supreme Court uses different criteria to determine whether or not something is constitutional based on the facts of the individual case. So the default standard of judicial review is something known as rational basis review. And what that means is that a law is considered constitutional if it is rationally related to a legitimate purpose of the government. So that's rational basis review. That famous footnote in 1938 is the beginning of a legal standard known as strict scrutiny. The strict scrutiny standard is a standard that says a law is only constitutional if it serves a compelling government interest, and it is narrowly tailored using the least restrictive means. So you can see the burden of proof is different in terms of determining whether a law is constitutional or not. Now, the Supreme Court uses strict scrutiny when a law potentially infringes upon a fundamental right. As I mentioned, the fundamental rights are the individual liberties in the Bill of Rights, plus those things like the right to marry, the right to travel within your country that I mentioned. So if you're challenging a law and saying this law violates a fundamental right, it is subject to a higher level of scrutiny from the court. In the 1970s, the Supreme Court expanded on this idea with the concept of intermediate scrutiny, which, as the name suggests, stricter than rational basis, not as strict as strict scrutiny. And intermediate scrutiny is used primarily for laws that treat men and women differently. So if you write a law and the text of the law says, we treat men this way, we treat women another way, it is subject to intermediate scrutiny. So we owe this tiered system of judicial review to the 14th Amendment. And the tiered system of judicial review is very important to Bill of Rights cases as well because of the fundamental rights designation. And then finally, it is the 14th Amendment that was used to eventually dismantle the de jure systems of discrimination that existed in this country until the mid-20th century. So really the most high-profile early Supreme Court decision, of course, is Brown v. Board of Ed, which said the segregation of public schools violates the Equal Protection Clause. There were a few kind of lower-profile decisions in the 1940s that kind of chipped away a little bit at the edifice of segregation. But by the mid-20th century, the court finally says, maybe we should interpret an amendment of the Constitution specifically created to eliminate racial discrimination to eliminate racial discrimination. Maybe that's how we should read the 14th Amendment. So it might have taken them almost 100 years, but better late than never, I guess. And I think these civil rights decisions are incredibly critical to understanding the Bill of Rights because when the founders were talking in such beautiful, flowery language about liberty, and they were not thinking about everyone and their pool of rights-bearing individuals, was limited to white men until the 20th century. So if you were not a white man, Bill of Rights wasn't really helping you out much until the 20th century. And even though the 14th Amendment was written specifically to deal with racial discrimination, because Bingham included that broader equal protection language, the 14th Amendment has been used to strike down laws that discriminate against women, laws that discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation. And now there are more 14th Amendment Supreme Court cases than any other amendment to the Constitution. So when we think about the importance of individual liberties, our minds immediately jump to all the liberties protected by the Bill of Rights. But as I said at the outset, we are very reliant on the 14th Amendment as the amendment which guarantees the liberties discussed in the first 10. And all right, I was told to keep it around 45 minutes for questions and kept it at 44, so very happy.